Welcome in. Get comfortable. Dim the lamp if it's still bright. Pull the blanket up to wherever feels right and let the day go slack for a while. You don't have to do anything for the next stretch except lie there and let some very old, very true stories wash over you. This is the Somnorian, where we read the dusty sources so you can fall asleep to them. And if you find the channel does that job well, a like or a subscribe genuinely helps. Only if you actually enjoy this though. I'm not going to beg. And before we get going, I always love knowing where in the world you're listening from tonight. A city, a country, a lonely truck stop at 2 a.m. So drop it in the comments if you feel like it, and I'll read them by the fire that I am absolutely, definitely tending in a real castle and not a small apartment. Tonight we're talking about medieval women, and specifically the ones running things while the men were away, which for large chunks of the Middle Ages was most of the time. Here's the shape of the problem, and it's a very medieval problem. A knight or a lord held land in exchange for military service, which sounds tidy until you realise military service meant physically leaving for months, for years, sometimes forever, to go stand in a wet field in France and die of dysentery before he ever saw a battle. Somebody had to keep the estate alive while he was gone. That somebody, almost always, was his wife. Not as a sentimental gesture, not as a favour she was allowed to do, as a job, with legal authority, that everyone from the peasants to the king understood to be hers the moment his horse cleared the gate. We should start with the woman who wrote the letters, because she's the reason we know any of this at first hand. Her name was Margaret Paston, and she lived in Norfolk in the 15th century, married into a family of ambitious gentry called the Pastons, and the reason we know her so intimately is that the family's correspondence survived. Over 1,000 letters, one of the largest private archives to come down to us from medieval England. Margaret's husband John was constantly away in London, tangled in the endless lawsuits that were the Paston family's real hobby, and so she ran the Norfolk estates and reported to him by letter, which means we get her voice, unfiltered, doing the job in real time, and her voice is magnificent. In 1448, while John was in London, a local rival's men came to take the church at Gresham, and Margaret's response was not to faint decoratively. Her response was to write to her husband and ask him to send her crossbows and windlasses to span them, and quarrels, that's the ammunition, because the house they were holding had low ceilings and there was no room to draw a longbow properly. She specified the equipment. She knew the ceiling heights. This is a woman placing a tactical weapons order in a letter that also, in the same breath, asks him to pick up some almonds and sugar and cloth for the children's gowns while he's in the city, because she was defending a manor and doing the shopping in a single paragraph, and honestly, which of us could? It got worse for her and better for us. In 1449, the rival, a man named Lord Mollins, sent a full force to Gresham while Margaret was inside, and they threw her out of her own house by, according to the family's account, undermining the very room she was standing in. 1,000 men, by the Pastons' telling, came and broke up the place, carried off the contents, and left her standing in the road. And what did she do? She wrote it up, itemised the damages, and kept fighting the legal case. Because in the medieval mind, losing the building was a setback, not a conclusion. The claim continued in the courts, and the letters continued, and Margaret kept managing the rest of the holdings as though being physically ejected from a manor was just Tuesday, which for a 15th century gentlewoman with an absent litigious husband, it more or less was. Now Margaret is vivid because she's on paper, but the role she was playing was completely standard, and it had a name and a shape that predated her by centuries. When a lord left, his wife became, in effect, the lord, the household's head, the estate's manager, the person the reeve and the bailiff answered to. And the medieval household was not a cottage. A great estate was a sprawling economic engine, arable fields worked by tenants who owed labour and rent, livestock, mills, fish ponds, woodland, orchards, a wine cellar if you were lucky and a French one, all of it generating income and consuming it, all of it requiring someone to actually keep the accounts and make the decisions about when to sell the grain and how much to spend salting down meat for the winter. The person keeping those accounts, in the Lord's absence, was the lady, and we know she was expected to be numerate and organised because people wrote her instruction manuals for exactly this. The best of these instruction manuals is a genuinely delightful document, and it tells you everything about what the job demanded. In the 1390s, an elderly Parisian, historians call him the Ménagier de Paris, the householder of Paris, wrote a long book of household instruction addressed to his very young wife. He was, by his own account, around 60, and she was around 15, which is its own separate horror we'll set aside. But the content of the book is a manual for running a substantial urban household, and it assumes she will be managing servants, supervising the accounts, overseeing the buying and the storing and the cooking, handling the estate in the country, and directing a staff, because he expected to die and leave her to run it all, possibly for a second husband, and he wanted her competent. He teaches her how to hire and manage servants, how to detect when a steward is skimming, how to keep the household's books, how to command a kitchen for a feast of dozens. This is a wedding gift in the form of an MBA, and the striking thing, reading it, is the total absence of the idea that any of this is beyond her. The anxiety in the book is entirely about whether she'll learn it fast enough, never about whether a woman can learn it at all. There's an even more explicit blueprint from a century earlier, and it comes with a warning label attached because it was written for a woman who suddenly had to do the job with no notice. Around 1265, the English bishop and scholar Robert Grosseteste, or someone working in his circle, composed a set of estate management rules for Margaret de Lacy, the Countess of Lincoln, a widow now responsible for enormous holdings. The rules are ruthlessly practical: how to audit your officials, how to know your total resources at the start of each year so you can plan your spending against them, how to travel between your manors consuming their surplus in person, rather than having it carted to you and stolen along the way, how to keep your household from eating you into debt. It is a document that assumes a great noblewoman is the chief executive of a multi-manor enterprise and simply needs the operating procedures, and it was written for her because she was in fact running the enterprise, and when a lord actually left for war, the handover of power was sometimes formal and total. There's a letter from around the 12th century, advice from a nobleman leaving on the Second Crusade, and versions of this scenario played out across every crusade and every campaign, where the departing lord effectively signs over the seal, the authority, the command of the garrison, all of it, to his wife. She could summon the tenants, she could hold the castle, she could, and this is the part that undoes people, conduct the defence of a fortress under siege, which several of them did, in armour or at least in command, directing the men on the walls. The most famous is probably Nicola de la Haye, who held Lincoln Castle in England in the early 13th century. She was the hereditary castellan, and when King John died and the country was torn by civil war and French invasion, she was an old woman, and she held Lincoln Castle against a besieging army in 1217 until relief arrived. And the battle that broke the siege was so decisive people called it the Lincoln Fair, as a grim joke about the looting afterward. She was in her 60s, she was defending a castle. The king, the boy King Henry III's regency government, subsequently appointed her sheriff of Lincolnshire, because when you have located the one person who held the castle, you give her the county. The medieval technical vocabulary even had precise words for a married woman's independent legal capacity, which tells you the law had to reckon with women acting on their own account constantly. In English common law, a wife was normally feme covert, her legal identity folded into her husband's, but a woman trading on her own, a feme sole, could sue and be sued and hold property and run a business in her own name, and widows automatically regained full legal personhood, which meant that a great many of the sharpest businesswomen in medieval England were widows who had inherited an estate and a lifetime of watching how it was run. Widowhood, brutal as it was to arrive at, was also the moment a medieval woman came into her full legal powers, and plenty of them used those powers to run their late husband's affairs better than the husbands had. Because here's the quiet thing the accounts keep revealing. Once you go looking, the men were away so relentlessly that the absence was closer to the normal condition than the exception. A knight owed castle guard and campaign service. A lord attended the king, sat on commissions, went on pilgrimage, fought in France, in Wales, in Scotland, in the Holy Land, and litigated endlessly in courts that were often days of travel away. Aristocratic marriage in this world was frequently a long-distance business partnership conducted by letter and by trusted messenger, and the partner who stayed put, who held the physical land, the actual seat of the family's power and wealth, was the wife. When you read the household accounts and the letters together, the picture that assembles itself is not of a delicate creature waiting at a window. It's of a woman with a ring of keys, a set of account rolls, a standing relationship with the family's lawyers, and the authority to raise the tenants in arms if someone tried her. Consider what the job actually contained on a given week. because the range of it is the whole point. She was the household's chief financial officer, checking the tallies the bailiff brought and knowing when the numbers were being cooked. She was the head of a workforce that could number dozens of servants, cooks, grooms, laundresses and clerks, all of whom she hired, disciplined and directed. She was the estate's face in the neighbourhood, receiving guests, maintaining the alliances and the feuds, deciding which local quarrels to inflame and which to smooth over. And in a society where power was personal and relational, that social diplomacy was not decoration, it was how the family stayed powerful. She was, when it came to it, the military commander of a fortified position. And on top of all of it, she was frequently doing the actual medieval lady tasks the stereotype allows her, the supervision of the dairy and the brewing and the textile work, the management of the still room and the medicines. Except those weren't dainty hobbies either. They were the production side of a self-sufficient economy, and running them badly meant the household went hungry or sick. The letters, when we have them, are full of this doubled load and completely unbothered by it. Margaret Paston writes to John about lawsuits and land and armed threats, and in the same breath about her health, the children, what he needs to buy in London, and the local gossip about who's marrying whom. And the gossip is not filler, because in that world knowing who was allying with whom by marriage was strategic intelligence. There's a tone in her letters, and in others like them, that's almost startlingly modern in its exhausted competence. The tone of a person holding an entire operation together and firing off updates to the partner who's off doing the glamorous, dangerous, useless part. At one point, she and other family members were physically besieged at Caister Castle, a castle the Pastons had inherited and that a duke wanted, and they held it against a force with cannon until they ran short of provisions and were forced to yield, and the correspondence about it is, again, that same blend of the tactical and the domestic, because that blend was simply what her life was. And I want to be fair about the shape of this, because it would be easy to swing too far and pretend the medieval world was some accidental utopia. It wasn't. The law generally subordinated wives to husbands. A woman's authority on the estate flowed, in the formal telling, from her husband's, exercised in his name and at his pleasure. And a woman who ran everything brilliantly for a decade could still, on his return or his death's aftermath, find her power contested by his male relatives or the crown. The system did not intend to empower these women. What the system did was create a structural vacuum. The man is gone, for years, and the machine must keep running, and then hand the controls to the person standing closest, who happened to be his wife, and who turned out over and over to be entirely capable of working them. The competence wasn't a loophole the women snuck through. It was the load-bearing assumption the whole arrangement quietly rested on, even as the culture told itself a different story about who was really in charge. So when we picture the medieval noblewoman, the swap worth making is this. Set aside the tapestry, the tower, the wimpled figure gazing wistfully toward the horizon for her returning lord. Put in her hands, instead, a bundle of account rolls, a bunch of keys, a letter half written to a husband who owes her 3 replies, and propped in the corner of a low-ceilinged room, a spanned crossbow loaded with the right ammunition for the space. Because Margaret Paston thought about that, and you probably wouldn't have. The horizon-gazing is the version that got painted later, by people who found the account-keeping, castle-holding, weapons-ordering version a little harder to romanticize. The real one was busy. She'd have your quarterly numbers ready before you finished asking. Chapter 2. Let's go south, to the sun and the sea and the medical school that shouldn't have let this happen. Picture Salerno on the western coast of Italy, in roughly the 11th and 12th centuries, a port town on the Tyrrhenian Sea, sitting at a crossroads where Latin Europe, the Greek-Byzantine world, and the Arabic learning of the Mediterranean all rubbed up against each other, and out of that collision grew something Europe hadn't really had before, a school of medicine. The Schola Medica Salernitana, historians call it, and it's often described as the first true medical school in Western Europe, a place where medicine was studied as a body of learned knowledge rather than passed hand to hand as folk practice. It drew on Hippocrates and Galen, on the Arabic medical texts flooding in through translation, on the practical experience of a busy port full of sick and injured people, and it produced a reputation so bright that, gone to Salerno to study physic became a kind of shorthand for medical authority across Europe. And here is the part that has caused male scholars a low-grade headache for about 800 years. Some of the physicians teaching and writing at Salerno were women. They even had a collective nickname in the later sources, the Mulieres Salernitanae, the women of Salerno, the Salernitan women, cited as a recognised body of medical authority on matters of women's health, the way you'd cite a school or a tradition. That phrase turns up in medical texts as a source you could lean on, which means that at some point it was simply normal to write, the women of Salerno say, the way you'd write the Arabs say, or Galen says. Sit with that for a second. In a period we've been trained to imagine as uniformly closed to women, there was a functioning intellectual community whose expertise on half the human body was so established that citing it lent your text credibility. And the most famous of them has a name, even if the centuries did their level best to sand it off. Her name was Trota, sometimes Latinized as Trotula, which is where a lot of the confusion starts, and she practiced and taught at Salerno, most likely in the 12th century. She was associated with a set of texts on women's medicine that circulated for centuries afterward, under the collective title the Trotula. And these were not obscure documents. They became some of the most widely copied and influential works on women's health in all of medieval Europe, translated out of Latin into French, English, Dutch, German, Irish, and more, turning up in library after library, quietly serving as the standard reference on gynecology and obstetrics for something like 400 years. When a medieval physician anywhere in Europe wanted to know about childbirth, about menstruation, about women's ailments, there's a very good chance the book he reached for traced back to Salerno and to Trota. Now, the Trotula is actually 3 separate texts that got bundled together, and untangling them is where modern scholarship has done its most satisfying detective work. There's a text on the conditions of women, one on treatments for women, and one on women's cosmetics. And for a long time all 3 were lumped under a single author, Trotula, who was then, in a move of breathtaking convenience, gradually doubted out of existence. The pattern went like this. The texts were too competent and too important, and the idea of a female author became uncomfortable. And so over the centuries, editors and scholars began to suggest that Trotula was a mistake, or a man, or a title, or a myth. Anything, really, other than a woman who knew what she was doing. The name got treated as a corruption. The person got treated as a legend. It's a very tidy little erasure, and it worked for a remarkably long time. Except the modern scholarship, and here I especially mean the work of the historian Monica Green, who spent years on these manuscripts, pulled the whole thing back apart and found that there really was a Trota, a real woman, a real practitioner at Salerno, and that at least one of the 3 bundled texts, the one on treatments, genuinely reflects her practice and her knowledge. The middle text is closest to the historical Trota. The others are created around her name, so the situation is almost funnier than a clean story would be. There was a real skilled woman physician. Her name got attached to a wildly successful medical compendium, and then the very success of the compendium became the reason people decided she couldn't have been real, because surely something this useful and this authoritative couldn't have come from her. The competence was used as evidence against the author. That's the whole medieval women problem in a single manuscript tradition. And what's actually in the texts is the thing that makes the erasure sting, because the content is good, practical, humane, and startlingly patient-centred in places. The Trotula deals with menstruation and its disorders, with conception and the difficulties of conceiving, with pregnancy and the management of childbirth, with complications of delivery, with care of the newborn, with a whole range of gynecological conditions. And it does so with a matter-of-factness about women's bodies that later, more prudish centuries found frankly indecent. There's material on easing difficult births, on repairing the physical damage of childbirth, on pain relief, on the ordinary catastrophes of reproduction in a world with no antibiotics and no safe surgery, treated not as shameful mysteries but as medical problems with medical management. Some of it, by modern standards, is of its time. The underlying theory is humoral, the physiology is Galenic and often wrong, but the stance toward the patient, the assumption that a woman suffering in childbirth is a thing to be actively and skillfully relieved, is exactly what you'd want your physician thinking, and it was being thought and written down by the women of Salerno while much of Europe was still deeply improvisational about the whole business. The cosmetics text deserves its own moment, because people tend to hear medieval women's cosmetics and picture something frivolous, and it is not frivolous. It's dermatology and cosmetic care set down systematically, with recipes and regimens for skin and hair and the mouth and the general maintenance of the body, some of it genuinely functional, some of it the usual medieval pharmacy of herbs and odd ingredients. What it tells you is that Salernitan medicine treated a woman's whole embodied life as a legitimate field of expert care, rather than dividing it into the serious parts a man would study, and the trivial parts a woman was left to muddle through. The women writing this took the entire subject seriously, because they lived inside it. Trotta wasn't the only woman associated with Salerno either, though she's the one whose name stuck hardest. The tradition names others. There are references to Salernitan women physicians as a recognised group, and later Italian medical culture, especially further north, would produce a scattering of named women practitioners, and even the occasional licensed one. The point is that Salerno wasn't a single freak occurrence, a lone woman who slipped through. It was an environment, a place, and a period where women practicing learned medicine was established enough to leave a documentary footprint and a cited authority, and that's precisely what makes it inconvenient, because a lone exception can be waved away as a fluke, but a school, a tradition, a recognised body of the women of Salerno is a lot harder to pretend didn't happen. What eventually happened to women in medicine is its own slow-motion tragedy, and Salerno sits right at the hinge of it. In the earlier medieval centuries, before medicine got fully institutionalised, healing was a broad and porous field. It included learned physicians, yes, but also surgeons, barber surgeons, apothecaries, midwives, and a vast informal world of women who tended the sick as a matter of course. Because in most households, then as for most of history, the person nursing the ill and dosing them and sitting up with them through the fever was a woman. Medical knowledge lived in that world too, not just in the universities, and then the universities arrived. Over the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, medicine became a university discipline, formalised, degreed, licensed, and women were barred from the universities. So the professionalisation of medicine, the thing we tend to think of as pure progress, functioned in practice as a gate, and the gate was built specifically to exclude the people who'd been doing large parts of the work all along. To practice as a licensed physician, you needed a university degree. Women couldn't get a university degree, therefore women couldn't be licensed physicians. Therefore a woman who practiced medicine was, increasingly, by definition, practicing illegally. The credential became the weapon. There's a court case that captures this so perfectly it almost feels staged, and it's real. In Paris in 1322, a woman named Jacoba, or Jacqueline, Félicie, was prosecuted by the medical faculty of the University of Paris for practicing medicine without a license. She wasn't accused of harming anyone, that's the astonishing part. Witnesses came forward and testified that she had treated them, that she had visited them, examined their urine and taken their pulse and prescribed for them, and that she had cured them when the licensed male physicians had failed. Her patients defended her. Her defence argued essentially that a woman patient might reasonably prefer to be examined and treated by a woman, and that her results spoke for themselves. And the faculty's response to "she cured people the licensed men couldn't" was, in effect, that it didn't matter, because the law was about the licence, not the outcome. An unlicensed person practising medicine was an offence regardless of whether the patients lived or died or got better, and she was a woman, and women could not be licensed. She was fined and forbidden to continue. The competence, once again, was not the point. She was too good, and it counted against her. So the arc runs from Trotta to Jacoba, from a woman whose medical texts conquered Europe to a woman prosecuted for curing people too effectively, and the difference between them is mostly the hardening of the institutions in between. Salerno belonged to the older, looser world where a skilled woman could teach and write and be cited. The university era that followed built the walls that would keep women out of formal medicine, in most of Europe, for centuries. Really until the 19th century, when women had to fight their way back into medical schools one lawsuit and one furious pioneer at a time, frequently being told, in language that would have been perfectly familiar in 1322, that it simply wasn't done, and the erasure was thorough enough that the memory of the earlier world got buried too. When Trotula, the author, was doubted out of existence, when the female physicians of Salerno faded into, well, that probably didn't really mean what it sounds like. What got lost wasn't just a few names. It was the evidence that the exclusion of women from medicine was a historical event, a thing that was done, at a particular time, for particular reasons, rather than an eternal natural fact. If Trotta never existed, then women were simply never doctors, and the walls of the university were just how things had always been. But Trotta did exist. The women of Salerno were cited by name for centuries, and the walls went up later, and on purpose, which means the story we inherited. Women couldn't do this, women were never here, was itself a kind of medieval fiction, drafted by the people holding the pens and the licenses. So the next time the phrase "women couldn't be doctors in the Middle Ages" drifts by, it's worth remembering it's true only for the back half, and only because someone made it true. In the port of Salerno, with the sea air coming in and the manuscripts stacking up, a woman named Trota was writing the book on how to bring a child safely into the world, and physicians across a continent were copying her out longhand, and for 400 years the standard European reference on women's medicine was, however hard people later worked to forget it, hers. Chapter 3. Pour yourself something, if you're the pouring kind. This one's about beer, and about the women who made it, and about how a perfectly respectable trade got turned into a horror movie costume. Let's start with the beer itself, because you have to understand how much of it there was. Medieval people drank ale in quantities that would put a modern person under the table and then under the ground, and they did it for a very sensible reason. The water was frequently unsafe, and ale, brewed, mildly alcoholic, made from boiled water and grain, was a calorie source, and a hydration source, and a safer bet than whatever was in the stream. Everyone drank it. Children drank a weak version of it. It was breakfast. Estimates for daily consumption in some medieval contexts run to the better part of a gallon a person, which sounds like a party but was really just Tuesday, because this was a low-alcohol staple food that happened to come in liquid form. And crucially, medieval ale, real ale before hops, didn't keep. Without hops as a preservative, ale went off within days of brewing, which meant it couldn't be made in one big central batch and shipped around. It had to be brewed constantly, locally, in small quantities, over and over, forever. It was perishable, it was essential, and it was made at home. And the home and the domestic work of it belonged to women. So brewing, for a very long stretch of the Middle Ages, was women's work. So much so that the trade had a female name built right into the language. A woman who brewed ale for sale was an alewife, or a brewster, and that word, brewster, is worth pausing on, because in Old and Middle English the ester ending was a feminine occupational suffix. A baker was a man who baked, a bakester or baxter a woman, a webber a man who wove, a webster a woman, a spinner and a spinster. And yes, that's the same spinster, a word that meant woman who spins long before it meant unmarried woman, because spinning was so thoroughly a woman's task that the word for the worker became the word for the unmarried woman who did it. And brewster meant a woman who brews. The language itself had encoded the fact that this was female labour. When the trade was still humble and domestic and barely profitable, the words for it were women's words, and it was, at first, wonderfully accessible as trades go, which is exactly why women dominated it. Brewing ale used equipment a household already had and skills a woman already possessed. It was, in essence, cookery, an extension of managing the kitchen and the grain and the hearth. A woman could brew a batch, sell the surplus to her neighbours, and turn her ordinary domestic competence into cash without leaving her house, or joining anything or being licensed by anyone. It required little capital. It fit around childcare and the rest of the household load. It could be done occasionally when money was tight, or regularly, as a steady sideline, and the records show enormous numbers of women doing exactly this, brewing intermittently, selling ale, appearing in the local court rolls where their brewing was taxed and regulated. The single richest source we have for medieval alewives is delightfully the enforcement records, the assize of ale, the system by which authorities regulated the price and quality and measure of ale, and fined people for breaking the rules. And the people being fined over and over, batch after batch, are overwhelmingly women. Now the assize of ale is one of the great comic institutions of medieval England, and it deserves a moment. The fines, in practice, functioned less like punishment and more like a licensing fee. Brewers were fined so routinely, so predictably, essentially every time they brewed and sold, that historians read the fines not as these women were criminals, but as this is simply what it cost to do business dressed up as a penalty. You brewed, you sold, you got fined a few pennies for it, you factored it in and did it again next week. It was a tax wearing the mask of law enforcement, and the court rolls of medieval villages are thick with the names of women cycling through it. There was even, in some places, an official called the ale taster, or ale conner, whose job was to test the ale and confirm it met standard. And the popular legend that he tested it by pouring it on a bench and sitting in it to see if his leather breeches stuck is almost certainly a later tall tale. But the office was real, and the fact that a whole bureaucracy existed to regulate ale tells you how central and how commercial the stuff was. And the alewife had a public image, and here's where we start walking toward the pointed hat. Because an alewife wasn't a shadowy figure, she was a fixture of town and village life, a woman running a small commercial operation in a world nervous about women running anything, and the culture developed a whole set of anxieties and stereotypes about her. She sold a product easy to water down, easy to shortchange on measure, and the literature and the sermons and the court records are full of suspicion that alewives cheated, gave short measure, adulterated the ale, charged too much, used false cups. There's a genuinely wild bit of medieval imagination on this. At Chester there was a set of religious mystery plays, and in one tradition of them the dishonest alewife who gave short measure ends up damned, carted off to hell as a warning, because cheating your customers on their ale was apparently a sin worth staging in front of the whole town. The alewife became a stock figure of moral suspicion, commercially independent, publicly visible, and therefore, in the medieval reckoning, a little bit dangerous. Now to the hat and the cat and the broom, because this is the part everyone half knows and gets slightly wrong, and the truth is better than the myth. The classic witch iconography, the tall pointed hat, the cauldron, the broomstick, the cat, has a tangled origin, and no serious historian will tell you it comes from any single source. But the alewife is genuinely one of the threads, and once you see how, you can't unsee it. Consider the alewife's actual working equipment and appearance. She often wore a tall hat, partly a matter of period fashion, partly a practical way to be seen above a crowd at a market, so people could spot the ale seller. She brewed in a large cauldron, because that's what you boil a batch of ale in. She frequently kept a cat, because a place storing grain has mice, and a cat solves mice. And she advertised that fresh ale was ready by hanging out an ale stake, a pole or a broom-like bundle stuck out over her door as a sign, the medieval equivalent of an open sign, telling passers-by that a new batch was available. Tall hat, cauldron, cat, broom by the door. Line those up next to the storybook witch and the resemblance is not a coincidence. It's a portrait of a working alewife with the commerce filed off and the menace filed in. The connection isn't that people literally thought every brewer was a witch. It's subtler and more interesting than that. It's that the visual vocabulary of the independent, commercially active, publicly visible woman, the alewife, distrusted for her trade, suspected of cheating, standing outside the ordinary supervision of a husband's household, became available as raw material when the culture went looking for an image of the dangerous woman. The costume was already sitting there, worn by a real and slightly resented figure, and it got borrowed. The suspicious alewife of the 14th and 15th centuries and the fearsome witch of later centuries share a wardrobe because they share an anxiety. A woman operating on her own account, handling money and mysterious brewing processes outside a man's control. And here is the part that turns the whole story from folklore into economics, because the alewives didn't just get costumed into witches, they got pushed out of the trade, and the timing tells you exactly why. Two things changed brewing in the later Middle Ages, and both of them worked against women. The first was hops. Hopped beer, beer brewed with hops as a flavouring and crucially a preservative, arrived in England from the Low Countries and the German lands over the 14th and 15th centuries, and it changed everything, because hopped beer kept. It didn't spoil in days, it lasted weeks, even months. And the moment beer stopped being perishable, the entire logic of the trade inverted. Perishable ale had to be brewed locally in small batches, which suited a woman working out of her own kitchen. Durable beer could be brewed in enormous quantities, stored, transported, sold at a distance, and sold at scale, which meant it suddenly rewarded capital, large premises, big equipment, and access to trade networks. Brewing was becoming an industry, and industries in this world were where the men and the money went. The second change followed from the first. As brewing grew larger and more lucrative, it organised itself into guilds, into companies, into formal commercial structures with regulations and membership and capital requirements. And these structures were, by their nature and often by explicit rule, difficult or impossible for women to enter as full independent members. The historian Judith Bennett studied this shift closely, tracking how women's role in the English brewing trade declined across the later medieval and early modern centuries, and the pattern she found is the pattern that keeps recurring in this whole story. As long as brewing was low status, low profit and domestic, It was women's work and no one much cared. The instant it became large-scale, profitable and prestigious, women were eased out and the men moved in, and the trade that had a woman's name baked into its very vocabulary became, within a few generations, a male industry. The word brewster survived. The women it described did not survive in the trade. So the arc of it is almost brutally clean. Beer starts as a perishable domestic staple, brewed by women out of their kitchens, humble enough that the language files it as women's work and the authorities treat it as a nuisance to be fined. It's essential, ubiquitous, and unglamorous, and so it's left to women. Then hops make it durable, capital makes it big, and profit makes it desirable. And as the value climbs, the women are edged out, guild by guild and regulation by regulation, until the alewife survives mainly as a figure of fun and suspicion, and then survives even more strangely as an involuntary contributor to the costume of the witch. The last thing left of the medieval brewster, in the popular imagination, is her hat, and her cauldron, and her cat, and her broom, transplanted onto a monster, and I find that genuinely one of the sadder little jokes in this whole subject, because there's nothing supernatural in the origin at all. It's just a working woman with a tall hat so you could find her in the market, a big pot because that's how you boil ale, a cat because grain draws mice, and a broom stuck out over her door to tell you the fresh batch was ready. That's a small business, that's a woman making a living, and the culture took that ordinary, competent, faintly resented figure, waited until men wanted her trade, took the trade, and then handed her image to the nightmares. The next time you see the pointed hat, you might spare a thought for the brewster it was stolen from. She gave you your Halloween silhouette, and in exchange history took her beer. Chapter 4. Let's move from the alehouse to the altar and talk about medieval marriage, which almost everyone gets wrong, and gets wrong in the same direction. Here's the assumption we all carry in, and it's not baseless. Medieval marriage is a transaction between men, the bride handed from father to husband like a parcel of land, her consent an afterthought at best, a legal fiction at worst, the whole thing arranged over her head for dynasty and property and alliance. And for the great aristocratic marriages, the ones that stitched kingdoms together, there's real truth in that picture. A 12-year-old heiress married off to seal a treaty was not, in any meaningful sense, consulted about her feelings. But sitting underneath all of that, governing every marriage in Latin Christendom from the peasant to the princess, was a body of law that said something genuinely startling, something that on paper cut directly against the parcel of land model. That a marriage required the free consent of both parties, the woman included, and that without her yes, there was, in the eyes of the church, no marriage at all. This is canon law, the law of the church, and it's important to understand that in the Middle Ages the church, not the state, owned marriage. Marriage was a sacrament, and disputes about it went to church courts, decided by canon law, and canon law had spent the 11th and 12th centuries working out, in enormous scholarly detail, what actually made a marriage valid. The man who more or less settled it was a 12th century theologian named Peter Lombard, and the doctrine that won out, associated with him and with the canon lawyers of the University of Paris and Bologna, was the consent theory of marriage. What made a marriage was not the father's agreement, not the property transfer, not the priest, not even, in the crucial formulation, the wedding night. What made a marriage was consent, the free, mutual consent of the two people expressed to each other. The couple married each other. The priest was a witness and a blesser, not the maker of the marriage, and the consequences of that principle, followed to their logical end, are wild. So wild that the medieval church spent centuries dealing with the fallout, because it had built a doctrine more radical than it was entirely comfortable with. If consent alone makes a marriage, then two people could marry each other, validly, permanently, sacramentally, with no priest, no church, no banns, no witnesses, no family, no ceremony, just the two of them, exchanging words of consent. And this was, in fact, the law. A valid marriage could be made by the couple alone. There was a technical distinction the canon lawyers drew, and it matters. Words of present consent. I take you as my wife. I take you as my husband, said now in the present tense, created a binding marriage on the spot. Words of future consent. I will marry you, created a betrothal, a binding promise, which then became a full marriage if the couple subsequently had sex, because the physical union was read as sealing the promise into the present. So a young couple exchanging present tense vows in an orchard or a promise followed by a night together, were as married, in the eyes of God and canon law, as any couple wed at a cathedral door. These were the clandestine marriages, and they were the great headache of the medieval church because they were valid and unprovable and everywhere. Two people could genuinely marry with nobody else present, which meant that later, when one of them wanted out, or wanted to marry someone else, or when a family objected, you could end up with a horrible tangle. He says they exchanged present vows. She says it was only a promise. She says they married. He says they never did. A whole village disputing whether words were said and in what tense. The church hated this. It couldn't police it, it couldn't prove it, and it couldn't undo it, because it had committed to the principle that consent makes the marriage, and it wouldn't abandon the principle. So it tried, over and over, to push marriage into the open, requiring bans, the public announcement of an intended marriage on 3 Sundays so objections could be raised, urging couples to marry publicly at the church door before witnesses, threatening penalties for clandestine unions. But, and this is the crucial thing, a clandestine marriage, even an illegal, penalised, disapproved of clandestine marriage, was still a valid marriage. The church would fine you for doing it in secret and then be forced to admit you were, in fact, married. The doctrine of consent was stronger than the church's own preference for order. Now watch what that does for the woman, because this is where the surprise lives. If her consent is legally necessary for a valid marriage, then her consent is a thing with power, a thing she can give, withhold, or dispute, and a thing the church courts will actually adjudicate. And they did. The records of the medieval church courts, especially the rich ones surviving from places like York in England, are full of marriage litigation, and a striking amount of it involves women using the consent doctrine as a tool. Women sued to enforce marriages, to compel a man to acknowledge that yes, he had exchanged present vows with her, and was therefore married to her, and couldn't wriggle off to marry someone wealthier. Women sued to escape betrothals they'd been pushed into, arguing they hadn't truly, freely consented. Women testified about the exact words that were said, and in what tense, and whether there were witnesses, because on those words the whole case turned. The church court became an arena where a woman's account of what she had and hadn't agreed to was legally decisive. There's a class of case that appears again and again, and it's oddly moving. A poor woman, sometimes a servant, claiming marriage to a man who's now denying it, perhaps because his family found her beneath them, perhaps because he simply changed his mind. Under a pure property model of marriage, she'd have no standing at all. She brought no dowry worth fighting over, no dynastic stakes. But under the consent model, if she could establish that they'd exchanged present tense vows, or made a promise and consummated it, then they were married, full stop, and his wealth and his family's objections were legally irrelevant. The law genuinely did not care that she was poor and he was rising. It cared whether the words had been said. Now, in practice, the powerful had 100 ways to lean on a court and grind down a poor claimant, and we shouldn't pretend the outcomes were always just. But the doctrine gave her a lever she would not have had in a system that treated her purely as an object of transaction, and the surviving cases show women reaching for that lever constantly. And the doctrine cut against the fathers too, which is the part that most upends the parcel of land picture. Because if a valid marriage needs only the couple's consent, then a couple could marry each other against their family's wishes, and the family's fury, however towering, could not unmake the marriage. This is precisely why clandestine marriage was such an aristocratic nightmare. An heiress could, in principle, marry a man her family despised in secret with present tense vows, and if she'd truly done it, it was done. Families guarded their marriageable children partly for exactly this reason, and the courts saw these cases. Young people who'd married for love or for lust or for their own reasons, and families trying to break it, and the church, however much it wished the young people had asked permission, bound by its own law to ask only one question, which was whether the two had freely consented. If they had, the marriage stood. The word free and free consent carried weight too, because the canon lawyers thought hard about what invalidated consent, and their list is more sophisticated than you'd expect. Consent extracted by force or by fear was not valid consent. A marriage a person was terrified or coerced into could be challenged as no true marriage, because the will hadn't been free. Consent given under a serious mistake about the identity of the partner was compromised. There were rules about the minimum age of genuine consent. Canon law set it low by our standards, around 12 for girls and 14 for boys. But it did set it, and a marriage arranged for children below the age of consent was not fully binding until they reached that age, and in effect ratified it or repudiated it, giving a young person at least a formal moment to refuse. None of this made the medieval world a paradise of romantic autonomy, but it means the legal architecture was built around the idea that a marriage is made by two consenting wills, and that a will can be too young, too frightened, or too deceived to count, which is a far more woman-regarding framework than the handed-over-like property story allows. And there's a genuinely radical edge to the whole thing when you set it in its context, which is that this consent doctrine gave the woman, formally, an equal role in the single most important legal act of her life, in a world where wives were legally subordinate to husbands in most respects, where, as we've seen, English common law folded a wife's legal identity into her husband's. The making of the marriage itself required her as a full and necessary party. Her yes carried the same constitutive weight as his. He could not marry her without her consent any more than she could marry him without his. At the threshold, in the exchange of vows, canon law treated them as equals, because the sacrament could not be made otherwise. It's one of the odd places where the medieval church, so often the villain in stories about women, planted a principle that pointed, however unevenly, toward the woman's own voice. Now, I want to be careful and honest here, because it would be easy to oversell this into a fairy tale, and the reality had hard limits. The consent doctrine was the law. Enforcement was patchy and slow and expensive. Powerful families found endless ways to arrange, pressure, and effectively coerce marriages while keeping the outward form of consent intact. A girl who'd been raised to obey, standing before her father and a suitor, consenting under a weight of expectation and fear that no court would ever recognise as coercion. The gap between a woman freely choosing and a woman consenting because refusal was unthinkable was, for many, the whole width of their lives, and the same courts that could enforce a poor woman's marriage could also be captured by the interests of the powerful. So the doctrine was not a shield that reliably protected every medieval woman. It was a principle, often honoured in the breach, frequently overwhelmed by the sheer pressure of family and property and custom. But a principle honoured in the breach is still a principle, and it still did real work. It gave the clandestine lovers a marriage no father could annul. It gave the abandoned servant a claim the court had to hear. It gave the coerced bride a possible argument that her fear had voided her vows. It made a woman's yes, and just as importantly her no, into a fact with legal consequences, in an era we imagine as having no room for either. And it embedded in the foundational law of Christian marriage a claim that would echo down the centuries, that a marriage is something two people do to each other freely, or it is not a marriage at all. So the swap to make here is subtle, but real. Keep the arranged marriages, the dynastic bargains, the 12-year-old heiresses traded across borders, those were real and often brutal. But set beside them the fact that the law governing all of it insisted at its core that the bride was not a parcel but a party, that the words came out of her own mouth or the marriage didn't exist, and that in the crowded, argumentative church courts of medieval Europe, women stood up and testified about exactly what they had and hadn't agreed to, and were heard. It's a stranger, sharper picture than the one we inherited. A world that could sell a woman in a treaty, and, in the next breath, tell her that no one on earth, not even her father, could marry her off without her own free yes. Chapter 5. Let's step behind the convent walls, because if you think the medieval church was a place where women went to disappear, I'd like to introduce you to a class of woman who went behind those walls and came out running half a county. We tend to imagine the medieval nun as a figure of retreat, the veil, the silence, the withdrawal from the world into prayer and obscurity, and for a great many women, in a great many convents, that was much of the reality. But at the top of the monastic world sat an office that was one of the most powerful positions a woman could hold anywhere in medieval Europe. The abbess, the head of a religious house, and the most powerful abbesses were not withdrawn from the world at all. They were feudal lords in everything but the sword. They held vast estates, collected rents and dues from hundreds of tenants, sat in judgment over those tenants in their own courts, controlled the appointment of parish priests across their lands, and in a handful of extraordinary cases minted their own coinage and answered to no earthly authority except the Pope himself. An abbess could be, functionally, a landed magnate who happened to wear a habit, and the men around her, knights, priests, even bishops, had to reckon with her power as a fact of the political landscape. Start with the estates, because the wealth is the foundation of everything else. A great abbey was often endowed over generations with enormous holdings of land given by kings and nobles for the good of their souls, and once given, that land belonged to the abbey, to the institution, and to the abbess who governed it. So the abbess was the lord of those manors in the fullest medieval sense. The tenants owed her their rents, their labour services, their fees. She held the manorial courts that judged their disputes and fined their offences. She managed the whole agricultural and financial engine of a great estate exactly as a secular lord would, except that she did it, in principle, forever, because the abbey didn't die and remarry and fragment its holdings. It accumulated. Some of the great female houses grew staggeringly rich over the centuries precisely because their endowments compounded rather than being split among heirs, and the woman at the head of such a house commanded resources that would have made many a nobleman envious, and with the land came jurisdiction, which is where an abbess's power stopped being merely economic and became genuinely governmental. In the Middle Ages, holding land often meant holding the right to justice over the people on it, the right to run courts, impose fines and enforce order, and abbesses held these rights along with everyone else. There were abbeys whose heads exercised extensive secular jurisdiction over whole towns and territories, effectively governing them, appointing officials, controlling markets, dispensing justice. The most spectacular examples are the great imperial abbeys of the German lands, houses like Quedlinburg and Gandersheim and Essen, where the abbess was a princess of the Holy Roman Empire, an imperial abbess, a Reichsäbtissin, a ruler in her own right, holding her territory directly from the emperor, sitting among the princes of the realm, subject to no lord below the emperor himself. The abbess of Quedlinburg governed her town and lands as a sovereign prince of the empire for centuries, right up until the whole structure was swept away in the early 19th century. That is not a woman in retreat. That is a woman who is in her own domain, the state. And then there's the coinage, which is the detail that tends to genuinely stop people, because minting money was one of the great marks of sovereignty, a right jealously guarded, associated with kings and the highest lords. Yet certain abbesses held the right to mint coins, and did. The abbess of Quedlinburg struck coins bearing her own name and image. Other great imperial abbesses did the same. Picture it plainly. A coin, passing hand to hand through the marketplace, stamped with the name and likeness of a woman who was the head of a convent, currency issued on the authority of an abbess. In a world that told itself women couldn't hold public power, some women's faces were literally the public face of the money. Now to the line that gives this chapter its spine, because it's the most delicious of the abbess's powers and the one that most infuriated the men who had to live with it. Certain abbesses were exempt. In church terms, exemption meant that a monastery answered not to the local bishop, the ordinary chain of command, but directly to the pope, leapfrogging the entire regional hierarchy. An exempt abbess did not take orders from the bishop in whose diocese her abbey physically sat. He could not visit her house to inspect it, could not discipline her nuns, could not exercise the authority over her that he exercised over every parish and priest around her. She was, within the church's own structure, outside his reach and above his level, accountable only to Rome, which in practice was far away and mostly content to leave her alone. So you could have the striking situation of a bishop, a prince of the church, and an abbess whose land sat in his diocese, and the abbess simply did not have to answer to him, and both of them knew it. The most famous, or infamous, of these exempt houses was the great Cistercian abbey of Las Huelgas, near Burgos in the Kingdom of Castile, founded in the late 12th century by the King of Castile, Alfonso VIII, and his queen, Eleanor, a daughter, incidentally, of Eleanor of Aquitaine, so keep that name filed away, we'll return to that family. Las Huelgas was a royal foundation, a burial place for kings, and its abbess was one of the most powerful women in Spain. The scope of her authority became legendary. She governed a large territory and numerous dependent communities, exercised jurisdiction over many towns and villages, confirmed appointments, and wielded a spiritual and temporal authority so sweeping that later commentators, with a mixture of awe and horror, described her as exercising powers that seemed almost episcopal, almost bishop-like. A woman whose writ ran over churches and clergy and lands as though she held a crozier. The exact limits were disputed and fought over for centuries, but the fact that people argued about whether an abbess's power crossed the line into a bishop's tells you exactly how much power was in question. And the phrase people reached for, the medieval formula for the anxiety this produced, was memorable. Critics complained that such abbesses acted as though they could do everything except say Mass and hear confession. Everything, in other words, but the specifically priestly sacramental acts reserved to ordained men. That was the one hard wall. An abbess, however powerful, was not a priest. She could not celebrate the Eucharist, could not absolve sins in confession, could not perform the sacraments that required ordination, because ordination was closed to women and stayed closed. So here is the strange shape of the abbess's power. She could hold land and judge tenants and mint coins and command priests and answer only to the Pope and rule a territory as a prince of the empire. She could do all of that, and she still could not stand at the altar and say the words of the Mass. The most powerful women in the medieval church ran everything up to the altar rail and were stopped cold at it. Enormous temporal power, a specific absolute sacramental exclusion. The abbess embodied both at once, and the contradiction was never resolved, only lived with. Let's put a face and a personality to the office, though, and go back much earlier, to 7th century England, and to Hilda of Whitby. Because Hilda shows you that the abbess's authority wasn't only about land and coin, it was about being taken seriously as a leader by the most serious men of the age. Hilda was of royal blood, related to the kings of Northumbria, and she became abbess of a great double monastery at Whitby, a double monastery being a house of both monks and nuns under a single head, and the single head was often a woman, was Hilda. Read that again, a community containing men, religious men, monks, governed by an abbess. Hilda ran Whitby with such a reputation for wisdom that our main source, the historian Bede, writing not long after, and no reflexive celebrator of powerful women, records that kings and princes came to her for advice, and that her judgment was sought and valued across the kingdom. She oversaw the education of men who became bishops, and in 664 Whitby hosted one of the most consequential events in the history of the English Church, the Synod of Whitby, the great gathering that decided whether the English Church would follow Roman or Irish practice on matters like the dating of Easter. It was held at her monastery, under her roof, with her as host and a participant in the deliberations. A synod that shaped the future of Christianity in England convened in the abbey of a woman who, by the rules, could not preach a sermon from a pulpit, and yet the bishops came to her house to decide the fate of the church. Whitby also gives us the loveliest small story about what an abbess's household could nurture, because it was under Hilda's care that Cedman, a humble, unlettered herdsman working at the monastery, was discovered to have a gift for composing religious poetry in English, and Cedman's hymn is often called the earliest recorded English poem. And it was Hilda who recognised the gift, who received him into the monastic community, who had him instructed and encouraged so that the poetry could flourish. The founding moment of English Christian verse happened because an abbess spotted the talent of a farmhand and chose to cultivate it. Whitby under Hilda was not a place of retreat from culture. It was a place where culture was made, presided over by a woman whose competence Bede simply reports as a matter of fact. Step back, and the pattern across the centuries is consistent, from Hilda in the 7th century to the imperial abbesses ruling into the 19th. The convent, for a woman of the right birth and ability, was not only a place of withdrawal, it could be a career, a base of power, an institution through which she exercised exactly the kinds of authority the secular world reserved for men, and sometimes more securely, because the institution outlived any individual and its wealth compounded. A noblewoman who might, in the secular world, have been married off and folded into her husband's identity could, in the church, become the head of a great house, a lord in her own right, a figure kings consulted and bishops could not command. It's one of the genuine ironies of medieval women's history, that the institution we most associate with the suppression of women also housed some of the most autonomous and powerful women in all of medieval Europe, and gave them a throne of sorts complete with lands and courts, and, in the grandest cases, their own coins. The wall was always there, the altar, the priesthood, the sacraments the abbess could not perform. But look at everything on her side of that wall. She judged, she governed, she taxed, she minted, she confirmed clergy, she hosted synods, she answered only to Rome, and men of rank came to her door for her counsel and her decisions. She could do everything but say the Mass. And on the strength of everything else, Some of these women were, without exaggeration, among the most powerful people of any sex in the world they lived in. Chapter 6. Stay with me in the world of the mind, because we're going to meet two women who didn't run estates or command tenants. They did something that made the powerful men of their age even more uncomfortable. They outthought them, on paper, in writing, and made those men answer. We tend to carry an assumption that medieval intellectual life was a closed men's club. The universities, the cathedral schools, the great theological debates all conducted by men, with women locked out by exclusion from the schools, which, as we saw with medicine, was largely true of the formal institutions. But intellectual authority in the 12th century didn't live only in the universities. It lived in letters, in books, in the reputation of a mind, in whether the most learned people of Europe took you seriously enough to correspond with you and cite you, and travel to consult you, and by that measure, the measure of whether the smartest men alive treated you as a peer, two women stand out so far that they've never really been erased, only at times condescended to. Hildegard of Bingen and Heloise, both 12th century, both in different ways minds that the men around them could not dismiss, however much some of them might have wished to. Start with Hildegard, because the sheer range of what she did is almost comic in its excess, the kind of resume that, if you invented it for a character, an editor would tell you to cut it down for being unrealistic. She was born around 1098 in the Rhineland, the 10th child of a noble family, given to the church as a girl, and she became a Benedictine nun, and eventually the head of her own community, founding a convent at Rupertsberg near Bingen on the Rhine, and running it as its abbess. That alone would place her in the last chapter. But Hildegard's abbacy was the least remarkable thing about her. She was a visionary who, in middle age, began recording the visions she said she'd experienced since childhood, and she compiled them, with theological commentary, into major works, the most famous being the Civias, a vast, strange, systematic account of her visions and their meaning. She was a composer, and here the achievement is genuinely extraordinary, because a large body of her music survives: liturgical songs, chants, an entire sung morality play called the Ordo Virtutum, the play of the virtues. And her music is not dutiful medieval plainchant. It's soaring, unusual, wide-ranging, instantly recognisable, and it's performed and recorded and loved today, which very few named 12th century composers of any sex can claim. She wrote on natural history and medicine, cataloguing plants, animals, stones and their properties and healing uses, a whole body of work on the natural world and the treatment of illness. She invented her own language, the lingua ignota, the unknown language, a constructed vocabulary with its own alphabet, for reasons that remain wonderfully mysterious. And she preached, in public, on tours. Let that last one sit, because it's the most quietly astonishing item on the list. Preaching in public was a function reserved to ordained men. Women, we're told, kept silent in church, and formal preaching was closed to them. And yet Hildegard, in her later years, undertook preaching tours, travelling through the Rhineland and beyond, preaching publicly to clergy and laity, in cathedrals and monasteries and public squares, denouncing corruption in the church and calling for reform. A nun, a woman, standing before assemblies of clergy and telling them to their faces where they'd gone wrong. She got away with it, and this is the crucial mechanism, because of how she framed her authority. Hildegard did not claim to preach on her own authority as a woman. That would have been indefensible in her world. She claimed to speak as a mouthpiece for God, transmitting what she received in her visions, a mere vessel, an unlearned woman. She often called herself a poor little figure of a woman, a porpacula, through whom the divine chose, pointedly, to speak because the men had failed. It was a brilliant rhetorical position, and possibly a sincerely held one, and it's both at once. By locating the authority in God rather than in herself, she made it nearly impossible to challenge without seeming to challenge God, and she turned her supposed weakness, her femaleness, her lack of formal education, into the very proof of divine involvement, because who but God would choose so unlikely a vessel? She weaponized humility. It was the one form of authority a woman could claim in that world, and she claimed it to the hilt and used it to say things no one else dared say. And the men listened, the most powerful men in Christendom. Hildegard corresponded with an astonishing range of the great figures of her age: popes, emperors, archbishops, abbots, kings, all writing to her and receiving her replies, seeking her counsel, her prayers, her judgment. Pope Eugenius III was shown her writings and gave them his approval, which was the endorsement that launched her public reputation. She wrote to the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. She corresponded with Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the towering religious figures of the century. When people wrote to Hildegard, they wrote as supplicants, asking a recognized authority for her wisdom, and her letters back are not deferential. They're often stern, admonishing, prophetic, telling powerful men where they'd gone astray and what God required of them. Near the end of her life, she got into a serious dispute with the ecclesiastical authorities at Mainz over the burial of an excommunicated man in her convent cemetery, and she stood her ground against them, arguing her case, even under an interdict that silenced her convent's music, and eventually she won. She died in 1179 in her early 80s, having spent a long life being exactly as formidable as she was, and the memory of her was strong enough that, though the formal process took literally centuries, she was eventually recognised as a saint and, in 2012, declared a Doctor of the Church, one of only a handful of women given that title, a formal acknowledgement that her teaching is of enduring value to the whole Church. It took the institution 800 years to officially catch up to what the popes and emperors of her own time already knew, that Hildegard was one of the great minds of her age. Now to Heloise, whose story is more painful, and whose intellect has been more persistently buried under the drama, because Heloise has the great misfortune of being remembered primarily as one half of the most famous tragic love affair of the Middle Ages. The woman in the story of Abelard and Heloise, and the love affair framing has done her a real disservice, because it turns a brilliant philosopher into a romantic supporting character. Let's undo that. Heloise, in the early 12th century in Paris, was already renowned for her learning while still young, remarkable for a woman, remarked upon by contemporaries, known for her command of Latin, and her reading not just in the standard Christian texts but in classical literature and philosophy. She was famous for her mind before she was famous for anything else, and Peter Abelard was the intellectual superstar of Paris, the most celebrated, most arrogant, most dazzling logician and philosopher of the day, a man who drew students from across Europe, and who, by his own later account, was so confident of his own brilliance and reputation that he deliberately arranged to become Heloise's private tutor in order to seduce her, using the cover of her education to get access to her. He tells this himself, with a self-lacerating candour, in his autobiography, The Historia Calamitatum, The History of My Calamities. What followed is the famous terrible sequence: the affair, a pregnancy, a child, a secret marriage that Heloise herself argued against, and then the catastrophe. Heloise's uncle and guardian, enraged, sent men who attacked and castrated Abelard, a brutal, mutilating revenge. Abelard, broken and humiliated, became a monk, and pushed Heloise, against her own wishes, into becoming a nun. She took the veil not out of religious calling, but, by her own devastating account, out of obedience to him, at his command. And there the storybook version usually leaves them, the ruined lovers, separated into cloisters, the tragedy complete. But the storybook version stops right before the part that matters most for our purposes, because what happened next was the letters, and the letters are where Heloise the philosopher steps forward, and frankly outclasses him. Years later, Abelard wrote his Historia Calamitatum, and a copy reached Heloise, now an abbess herself, running a convent, and she wrote to him. What survives is an extraordinary correspondence, and Heloise's letters are astonishing documents, fierce, unflinching, philosophically rigorous, and emotionally honest in a way that cuts straight past Abelard's self-pity. She refuses the consolations of piety he offers her. She confronts him with the reality that she became a nun for him, not for God, and she will not pretend otherwise, will not perform a repentance she doesn't feel. And she raises arguments about love, about intention, about the ethics of desire, that engage directly with the moral philosophy of the day, and she does it with a clarity and a boldness that made Abelard, the great logician, visibly uncomfortable in his replies. Her most famous and most philosophically loaded position is her argument about the ethics of intention. Her insistence argued directly to Abelard that the moral worth of an act lies in the intention behind it, not the act itself, that she is innocent in her love because her intention was pure love, freely given, and guilty only where her intention was corrupt. This is not a lovelorn woman weeping. This is a philosopher advancing a serious ethical thesis, and it happens to overlap strikingly with the very ethics of intention that Abelard himself is famous for developing in his moral philosophy. Scholars have argued for a long time, and still argue, about how much Heloise shaped or anticipated ideas that we credit to Abelard, and the honest answer is that we can't fully untangle two minds that formed each other, which is itself the point. She wasn't his student in these letters, she was his intellectual equal, arguing with him on level ground and often winning the exchange. There's a famous piece of her reasoning that people find genuinely shocking even now, and it's the argument she reports having made against marrying Abelard in the first place. She didn't want to marry him, and her reasoning was partly that marriage would ruin his career as a philosopher and churchman, but partly something stranger and prouder. She declared, and Abelard reports her saying it, that she would rather be called his lover, his mistress, his whore even than his wife, that she preferred love freely given to a bond secured by law, that a woman who married for security or status sold herself, whereas a woman who loved freely gave herself, and the free gift was the nobler thing. She dressed the argument in appeals to classical philosophers, to the ideal of the philosophical life unencumbered by domestic ties. Whatever you make of it, it is not the reasoning of a passive victim. It's a woman constructing a philosophical case for a radically unconventional position, in defiance of every social pressure telling her that marriage was what a woman was supposed to want, and holding it with total conviction. And Heloise the abbess, in the decades after, was formidable in exactly the practical ways we've been describing. She ran her convent, the Paraclete, with skill and rigour, and she pressed Abelard in their correspondence for real intellectual work. She wrote to him with hard theological questions, demanded that he compose a rule of life suited to women rather than one borrowed from men's monasticism, and pushed him to think about what a religious life designed for women would actually look like. She used the correspondence not only to confront their shared past, but to extract serious scholarship from the most famous theologian in France, essentially setting him assignments. The abbess was commissioning the philosopher, and her contemporaries knew her worth. Peter the Venerable, the great abbot of Cluny, one of the most respected men in the church, wrote to Heloise in warm and admiring terms, praising her learning and her leadership, treating her as a distinguished person in her own right, not as the notorious woman from a scandal. So set the two of them side by side, Hildegard and Eloise, and see what they share underneath their very different lives. Neither had access to the universities, or the formal apparatus of learning that the men around them took for granted. Both, in different ways, built their authority anyway, Hildegard by claiming the voice of God and using it to preach and admonish across Christendom, Heloise by sheer philosophical force in a correspondence that has never stopped being read. And both compelled the most learned and powerful men of the 12th century to engage with them as equals. Popes and emperors writing to Hildegard for counsel, the greatest logician in France meeting Heloise's arguments and coming off worse. These weren't women grudgingly tolerated at the edge of the intellectual world. They were correspondents the centre of that world could not ignore, because their minds were simply too good to file away. The condescension came later, and it's worth naming because the later centuries did to both women a version of what they did to Trota. They softened the intellectuals into figures easier to manage. Hildegard got remembered as a mystic, a visionary, a slightly eccentric saint. The theology and the reform preaching and the fierce letters to popes quietly downgraded to her visions. Heloise got remembered as a lover, the tragic heroine of a doomed romance, the philosophy, the ethics of intention, the arguments that unsettled Abelard reduced to the emotional weather of a love story. In both cases, the mind got dissolved into something less threatening. But the letters survive, the music survives, the arguments survive, and when you read them, not as mysticism and not as romance, but as the intellectual work they actually are, you find two women who could think circles around most of the famous men of their century, and who did, and whose correspondence, the popes, the emperors, the philosophers, knew it perfectly well, and wrote back. Chapter 7. Let's meet a woman who took everything we've been circling, the competence, the intellect, the refusal to be dismissed, and turned it into something new in European history, a career. She made her living by writing, professionally, as arguably the first woman in the West we can truly call a professional author, and she used that pen to do something deeply satisfying. She fought back in print against several centuries of men writing insults about women, and she did it with her sources cited. Her name was Christine de Pizan, and she was born around 1364 in Venice, though her life was spent in France, because her father, Tommaso da Pisano, was a physician and astrologer who took a post at the French court of King Charles V. Charles the Wise, a king who genuinely valued learning and built one of the great libraries of the age. So Christine grew up at a cultivated court around books and learned men, and, this is the first crucial break in her favour, her father believed in educating her. This was not universal, to put it mildly. Plenty of learned men of the age would have seen no point in teaching a daughter. But Christine's father encouraged her, learning against, she tells us, some resistance, and she absorbed everything she could: languages, literature, the classical and Christian texts that furnished an educated medieval mind. She married young, around 15, to a court secretary named Etienne de Castel, and by her own account it was a genuinely happy marriage, a partnership, and for a while her life was comfortable and settled and unremarkable. And then, in the space of a few years, it all collapsed, and the collapse is the making of her, because it forced her into the thing she became. Her father died. And then, around 1390, when Christine was about 25, her husband Etienne died suddenly of an epidemic while away from home, leaving her a widow with 3 children, her mother, and possibly other dependents to support, and, as widows so often discovered, a tangle of financial affairs, disputed money and lawsuits that dragged on for years. She was young, she was responsible for a household, and she had no husband and no father to stand between her and the world. And here is where Christine did the thing that makes her extraordinary. She did not remarry, which was the expected solution, the safe path, the thing a young widow was supposed to do to restore a man to the head of the household. Instead, she decided to support her family herself, by writing. She's very open in her later work about how this happened, and it's a wonderful account of a self-made professional finding her craft. She began, she tells us, with poetry, lyric poems, ballads, love poems, the fashionable courtly verse of the day, and she was good at it, good enough that her work circulated and found an audience at the very court she'd grown up in. She had connections there, a known name, patrons who remembered her father, and she cultivated them deliberately and skillfully. And she did something that shows just how professional she was. She supervised the production of her own books. In an age of manuscripts before print, a book was a physical object copied and illuminated by hand, and Christine oversaw the making of beautiful presentation copies of her works, organising scribes and illuminators, sometimes probably doing some of the copying herself, producing luxurious volumes dedicated to powerful patrons who would reward her for them. She was author, editor, and production manager of her own literary business. She built a career, brick by brick, out of nothing but her education and her determination, and she made it pay well enough to raise her family. That's the first professional woman writer claim in a nutshell. Not a woman who wrote and happened to be paid, but a woman who consciously built her living from the pen and sustained it for decades. But the poetry, good as it was, isn't why we remember her. We remember her because she picked a fight, a big one, with a very large and very entrenched target, and she picked it deliberately. The target was the entire medieval literary tradition of writing badly about women. There was, running through medieval literature, a deep vein of misogynist writing, a whole genre of texts, sermons, satires, and learned treatises that portrayed women as inherently deceitful, lustful, foolish, weak, a plague upon men, the daughters of Eve responsible for the fall of mankind and not to be trusted with anything. This wasn't a fringe view scrawled in the margins, it was mainstream, respectable, repeated by revered authorities, treated as settled wisdom. And Christine, reading this material as an educated woman, had the entirely reasonable reaction of, "This is wrong, this doesn't match anything I know of actual women or of my own experience, and I am going to say so." Her first major public fight was over a specific book, and it's worth knowing because it shows her stepping directly into the literary arena and taking on the men who ran it. The book was the Roman de la Rose, the Romance of the Rose, an enormously popular and hugely influential French poem. The second part of it, written by Jean de Meun, was learned and clever and also, in Christine's view, full of contempt for women, portraying them cynically and coarsely. And in the early 1400s, Christine attacked it, in writing, in a debate now called the Querelle de la Rose, the Quarrel of the Rose. She exchanged letters with the poem's defenders, educated, prominent literary men, humanists and royal secretaries who admired the rose as a masterpiece, and she argued against them, that its treatment of women was slanderous and morally corrosive, that a work so admired shouldn't be teaching contempt for half the human race. Picture the nerve of that. A widow, a woman with no university position and no clerical standing, publicly taking on the male literary establishment over the meaning and morality of a canonical text, and holding her own in the exchange. She lost none of her dignity and gave none of the ground, and the very fact that these men argued back, engaged her as an opponent worth answering, shows she'd forced her way into a conversation she was never supposed to be part of. And then she wrote the book that answers the whole tradition, and it's her masterpiece, Le Livre de la Cité des Dames, the Book of the City of Ladies, completed around 1405. And it's a brilliant piece of construction, because it doesn't just complain about misogyny, it systematically dismantles it, and builds something in its place. The book opens with Christine herself as a character, sitting in her study, depressed and shaken by the sheer weight of all the male authorities she's been reading, who insist that women are wicked and defective. And she describes wondering in genuine despair how so many wise and learned men could all be wrong, and half believing they must be right, because who was she against all of them? And then 3 allegorical ladies appear to her, reason, rectitude and justice, and they tell her in effect, they're wrong, and we're going to prove it, and you're going to build a city. The conceit of the book is that Christine, guided by these 3 figures, constructs an allegorical city, the City of Ladies, whose every stone and wall and tower is a real woman of virtue and accomplishment, drawn from history, mythology, scripture and legend, so that the finished city is a fortress populated entirely by admirable women, a standing refutation of the claim that women are worthless. And the method is the part I find genuinely delightful, because it's the ancestor of a move we'd recognise instantly today. She answers the misogynists with evidence, case after case, example after example. Women who were brave, wise, learned, chaste, loyal, inventive, strong. Women who ruled well, who fought, who created, who endured. The warrior queens and the female scholars and the inventors and the saints. Christine marshals them all as counterexamples, systematically refuting each stock accusation against women with a woman who disproves it. They say women are cowardly. Here are the warriors. They say women can't learn. Here are the scholars. They say women are faithless. Here are the models of loyalty. It's argument by accumulated counter-evidence, a patient, relentless, well-sourced rebuttal of a prejudice, built case by documented case. The medieval equivalent of responding to a sweeping insult with a thoroughly footnoted, "Actually, let me give you some examples." She takes the authorities who dismissed women and answers them not with fury alone, but with data, with the historical and legendary record of women who prove them wrong. She even confronts the deepest and most weaponized charge head-on, the theological one, the claim that woman, through Eve, brought sin and death into the world and is therefore fundamentally to blame for the human condition. Christine, through her allegorical guides, reasons her way around it, reframing the story, emphasizing counter-arguments and counter-examples, refusing to accept that womankind stood condemned by the account in Genesis. And she wrote a companion volume too, The Treasure of the City of Ladies, sometimes called the Book of the 3 Virtues, which is more practical, a book of advice for women of every station, from princesses to the wives of labourers, on how to live wisely and manage their lives and their households and their difficulties in the actual world they inhabited. So she both defended women in the realm of ideas and offered them concrete, practical counsel for real life. She wasn't only winning an argument, she was trying to help her readers. Christine's later life bends towards something that surprises people, and it's a fitting capstone, because she didn't retreat into being a women's writer in some narrow sense. She wrote across the full range of serious subjects, on politics and government and even war. She wrote a biography of the king she'd grown up under, Charles V, commissioned as an official work. She wrote on the education of a prince, on the body politic, on the proper conduct of rulers, and remarkably she wrote a manual on warfare and military affairs, the Book of Deeds of Arms and of Chivalry, drawing on the classical and medieval authorities on the art of war, a technical treatise on how armies should be raised and campaigns conducted and the laws of war observed, a woman writing the manual on how to make war in the early 15th century, and writing it well enough that it was taken seriously and copied and used. It's the same pattern we keep meeting. a woman entering a domain declared entirely male and simply doing the work competently, forcing the record to include her, and her life ended on a note that ties this whole series together, because Christine lived long enough into the 15th century to witness the arrival of the woman we'll close this whole script with. France in Christine's later years was being torn apart by the 100 Years' War and civil strife, and she eventually withdrew from public writing, retiring most likely to a convent, and fell largely silent. But in 1429, near the very end of her life, and after years of silence, she was moved to write one last poem, and its subject was Joan of Arc. Christine, the woman who'd spent her career arguing that women were capable of virtue and courage and greatness, lived to see a teenage peasant girl take up arms, lift the siege of Orléans, and lead the French to victory, and she wrote a poem of pure exultation about her, the Ditier de Jehanne d'Arc, celebrating Joan as the living, breathing vindication of everything Christine had spent decades arguing on paper. It's one of the few contemporary works about Joan written during Joan's own lifetime, and it was written by the first professional woman author in Europe who saw in the warrior girl the proof of her life's thesis. The theorist of women's worth got to salute the woman who embodied it, in real time, before either of them knew how Joan's story would end. Christine died around 1430, probably without learning of Joan's capture and death, which is a small mercy. She got to end on the triumph. So the swap to make with Christine de Pizan is to stop thinking of the professional woman writer, the woman intellectual with a public career and pointed opinions, as a purely modern arrival. 600 years ago, a widow with 3 children and no husband to shelter behind decided to feed her family with her mind, built a lasting career doing it, publicly took on the male literary establishment over how they wrote about women, answered centuries of accumulated insult with a systematically argued, thoroughly exampled defence, wrote across politics and war and history, and lived to hail Joan of Arc as the vindication of it all. She did it in manuscript by candlelight, dictating to scribes and supervising illuminators, in a world that gave her every reason to remarry and go quiet. She didn't go quiet. She picked up the pen, cited her sources, and built a whole city out of the women the men had tried to write out. Chapter 8. Let's go from the woman who argued that women could rule to the women who simply did it, who weren't standing decoratively behind a throne, but were, for years at a stretch, the throne itself, holding whole kingdoms together with their own hands while the chroniclers scrambled to find a way to describe it. There's a phrase that gets used to soften this, behind every great king, and it drives me a little mad, because for the women in this chapter, it's not that they stood behind the king, it's that when the king was a child or captive or dead or simply absent, they were the government. Medieval monarchy had a built-in mechanism for this, and it's the key to the whole chapter, the regency. When a king died, leaving an heir too young to rule, someone had to govern in the child's name until he came of age, and that someone, over and over across medieval Europe, was the boy's mother, the queen, who became regent and wielded in practice the full power of the crown. A regent wasn't a placeholder waving from a balcony. A regent raised armies, levied taxes, made law, conducted diplomacy, crushed rebellions, and ran the state, because the state doesn't pause for a decade waiting for a child to grow up. And the medieval world, for all its theories about women, handed this job to women constantly, because the alternative, trusting an ambitious male relative not to simply steal the throne from the child, was often far more dangerous. A mother could be trusted to defend her own son's crown as no uncle could, so maternal love became, coldly, a constitutional asset, and mothers became rulers. Let's begin with the one whose name you probably already know, because she's the closest thing the Middle Ages has to a household name among royal women, and even she is usually remembered for the wrong things, Eleanor of Aquitaine. And I want to rescue her from the romance, because Eleanor tends to get filed under scandalous queen, married 2 kings, very glamorous, and the glamour buries the politician. Start with the raw fact of her inheritance. Eleanor was the heiress to the Duchy of Aquitaine, an enormous wealthy territory covering much of southwestern France. She was, in her own right, one of the greatest landholders in Europe, a sovereign duchess, and that land was hers, the source of a power that outlasted every man she married. She was first married, very young, to the King of France, becoming Queen of France as the wife of Louis VII. She even went on the Second Crusade with him, travelling to the Holy Land, which was itself remarkable. That marriage soured and, crucially, it was annulled, and Eleanor walked away with her duchy intact, still the ruler of Aquitaine, still one of the most eligible and powerful people in Europe. And then, with striking speed and political audacity, she married Henry, Duke of Normandy, who shortly afterward became King Henry II of England. So Eleanor became Queen of England, having previously been Queen of France, uniting her vast French holdings with the Angevin Empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. But it's the last third of Eleanor's very long life that shows what she really was, because after decades of marriage, during which she bore Henry many children, including 2 future kings, she and her sons rebelled against Henry, and when the Great Revolt of 1173-74 failed, Henry had his own queen imprisoned. Eleanor spent something like 16 years in confinement, held by her husband for backing their sons against him, and she endured it, and she outlasted him. When Henry died in 1189 and their son Richard the Lionheart, became king, Eleanor was released, and now, an old woman in her late 60s, she came into her own as one of the most important political figures in Europe. Because Richard the Lionheart spent almost his entire reign away from England, on the Third Crusade, then imprisoned in Germany, then fighting in France, which meant England needed governing, and Eleanor governed it. She acted as regent, held the kingdom stable, and when Richard was captured and held for an enormous ransom, it was Eleanor who drove the raising of that colossal sum across England, and personally travelled to escort her son home. She was by then past 70, crossing the Alps on the business of the crown, and when Richard died and her younger son John took the throne, Eleanor, now in her late 70s, was still at it, still travelling, still negotiating, still defending the family's holdings, at one point withstanding a siege. She lived to around 80, and she spent her final decades not as a dowager in retirement, but as the load-bearing pillar of the Angevin dynasty, the one steady hand through the chaos of her son's reigns. Now let's meet a woman who was denied a crown she had every right to, and whose fight for it plunged an entire kingdom into years of civil war, the Empress Matilda, and her story is the sharpest illustration of both how much power a medieval woman could reach for and exactly where the wall stood. Matilda was the daughter of King Henry I of England, and when her only legitimate brother drowned in a shipwreck, she became her father's heir. Henry I, having no surviving legitimate son, named Matilda his successor, and made his barons swear oaths to accept her as their ruler. A woman, designated to inherit the throne of England in her own right. She had the pedigree in excess. She'd been married young to the Holy Roman Emperor, which is why she's called Empress ever after, and after his death she'd been remarried to a French count. So when Henry I died in 1135, Matilda should, by her father's arrangement and the barons' sworn oaths, have become England's ruler. Instead, her cousin Stephen moved fast, crossed to England, and had himself crowned king, and most of the barons, who had sworn to support Matilda, conveniently discovered they'd rather be ruled by a man. And so began the long, grinding civil war that the English called, with grim understatement, the Anarchy. And Matilda fought for her throne for years, and at one point she very nearly won it outright, which is the detail that makes her story so poignant. Her forces captured Stephen himself in battle in 1141, and with the reigning king a prisoner, Matilda was, for a few months, the effective ruler of England. She came to London to prepare for her coronation, on the very cusp of being crowned queen in her own right, the first woman to rule England as monarch. And then it slipped away, because the moment demanded the one thing the age would not let a woman have: unqualified acceptance as a sovereign. The Londoners turned against her. Contemporaries complained she behaved too imperiously. The exact same assertiveness that would have been unremarkable, even admirable, in a king was read as intolerable arrogance in a woman on the edge of the crown, and she was driven out of London before she could be crowned. The war ground on, her position weakened, her captured enemy Stephen was eventually exchanged and freed. Matilda never became queen, but, and this is her real victory, she never abandoned the claim, she kept fighting for her cause and her sons, and the war was ultimately settled by a compromise. Stephen would reign for his lifetime, but Matilda's son, Henry, would succeed him. And Matilda's son duly became Henry II, the very Henry who married Eleanor of Aquitaine. So Matilda didn't win the crown, but she won the dynasty. The line of English kings runs through her, not through Stephen. She lost the battle for the throne and won the war for the bloodline, and she governed her son's continental territories capably for years afterward, an elder stateswoman whose fight had reshaped the succession of England. Now to my personal favourite in this chapter because she succeeded exactly where Matilda was thwarted, Blanche of Castile, who ruled France twice and ruled it superbly. Blanche was a Spanish princess, a granddaughter in fact of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the family keeps recurring, married to the future King Louis VIII of France. Louis VIII reigned only a few years and died in 1226, leaving Blanche a widow with a 12-year-old son who was now King Louis IX, and leaving Blanche as regent of France for the boy. And France in 1226 was not a stable inheritance to defend. The great barons of the realm, sensing weakness in a kingdom ruled by a foreign-born woman on behalf of a child, moved to exploit it, and Blanche faced immediate, serious baronial rebellion. And she crushed it. She rallied loyal forces, she outmaneuvered the rebel barons diplomatically and militarily. She held the boy king's authority together against men who fully expected to walk over her, and she secured the throne for her son through years of turbulence. She was decisive, she was politically ruthless when she needed to be, and she was effective. She governed France as regent through her son's minority and stabilised the kingdom. And here's the part that seals it. Her son, Louis IX, grew up to become one of the most revered kings in French history. Saint Louis, the king so admired that he was canonised, and Blanche's regency was so trusted that when Louis, as an adult king, left France to go on crusade to the Holy Land, he appointed his mother to govern the kingdom in his absence. Again. So Blanche ruled France a second time, as regent for her absent crusading son, running the entire realm while he was overseas, and she governed it competently right up until her death in 1252, which came while Louis was still away on crusade. A woman ran the Kingdom of France twice across 2 decades of the 13th century, and did it so well that her son became a saint and never seems to have doubted for a moment that his mother was the safest pair of hands in the realm. That's not standing behind the throne. That's holding the throne in full public view and being trusted with it above every man in France. Let's cross the sea to Jerusalem, because the Crusader states produced one of the most fascinating ruling women of the age, and her story shows a woman fighting to hold power that was legally, explicitly hers. Queen Melisande of Jerusalem. Melisande was the eldest daughter of the King of Jerusalem, and because he had no sons, she was his heir. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was to pass to her. Her father arranged her marriage to a European nobleman, Fulk of Anjou, and the intention, as her father set it up, was that Melisande and Fulk should rule jointly, together, as co-monarchs. Her royal blood was the foundation of the claim, and the kingdom was meant to be hers as much as his. But once Fulk became king, he tried to sideline her, to rule alone and push his queen out of the power that was rightfully hers by inheritance, and Melisande fought back. She had powerful support among the nobility of the kingdom who recognised her hereditary right, and the conflict was serious enough that Fulk was eventually forced to back down and acknowledge her as a genuine co-ruler, sharing real power. She wasn't a consort permitted a decorative role. She was a hereditary queen who compelled her own husband to treat her as the co-sovereign she legally was, and after Fulk died, Melisande became regent for their young son Baldwin, and ruled the kingdom of Jerusalem in her own right during his minority. And then, in a striking echo of Matilda's story with a different ending, when her son grew up he wanted sole power, and his mother didn't simply hand it over. There was a genuine struggle between mother and adult son over control of the kingdom, and even after Baldwin asserted himself, Melisande remained a powerful and respected figure, consulted and influential, holding lands and authority, right up until her final illness. She ruled a Crusader kingdom on the frontier of Christendom, surrounded by external enemies, and held real sovereign power there for decades. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, that hard-fought prize of the Crusades, was governed for a substantial stretch of the 12th century by a woman who inherited it, defended her right to it against her own husband, and passed it to her son only on her own terms. Step back and look at the shape of all 4 lives together: Eleanor, Matilda, Blanche, Melisande, and the same structure keeps appearing. In each case, a woman reached genuine sovereign power through a combination of inheritance, marriage, and above all the regency for a son, and in each case she exercised that power in the fullest sense, raising armies, fighting wars, crushing or surviving rebellions, conducting the diplomacy and the governance of a kingdom, and in each case the chroniclers watching it happen reached for a vocabulary that could barely contain it, praising the successful ones by saying they'd ruled like a man, or with a manly spirit, which was the highest compliment the age could pay a competent female ruler and also a perfect little confession that the language had no category for what it was watching. A woman governing well was so far outside the official theory that the only way to describe her competence was to borrow the word for a man. But the competence was real, and the power was real, and the record, however grudgingly, however wrapped in that backhanded praise, was forced to write them down, because you cannot pretend a woman didn't rule a kingdom when she demonstrably ran it for 20 years. The wall, where it existed, was specific, and it's worth naming precisely, because it clarifies the whole picture. The difficulty was almost never a woman exercising royal power. That happened constantly and was broadly accepted, especially through the Regency. The difficulty was a woman holding the crown in her own name, as sole reigning monarch, the anointed sovereign herself rather than the ruler on behalf of a husband or a son. That was the threshold Matilda died just short of. A queen could govern a kingdom for decades as a regent and be honoured for it. A woman claiming the throne outright, as its crowned and reigning holder, ran into a resistance that even sworn oaths and the clearest inheritance often couldn't overcome. And yet even that wall was cracking and inconsistent. Melisande was a hereditary queen who forced recognition of her own royal right, and elsewhere in Europe women did inherit and hold thrones. The rule was less a rule than a prejudice, applied unevenly and repeatedly overwhelmed by the simple fact that a kingdom needs governing, and the best available person to govern it was often enough the queen. So the correction to make is to stop imagining the medieval queen as an ornament of the court, a producer of heirs and a wearer of crowns at ceremonies. Some of the most consequential political figures of the entire Middle Ages were women who governed kingdoms, who defended borders, led the raising of ransoms and armies, sat in judgment, made and broke the powerful, and held whole realms steady through the deaths and absences and captivities of the men who were supposed to be in charge. Eleanor crossing the Alps at 70 on the crown's business, Matilda within a breath of the English throne, Blanche smashing a baronial revolt to keep her son's crown safe, and then ruling France again while that son crusaded. Melisande forcing a king to share the kingdom she'd inherited. Not behind the throne, on it, or holding it up with both hands, for years at a stretch, in the full and reluctant view of a world that had to invent compliments about manliness just to admit what it was seeing. Chapter 9. Let's come down out of the palaces and the convents, off the battlefields and out of the great households, into the ordinary noise of a medieval town, the streets and the market stalls and the workshops, because this is where the largest number of independent, working, money-handling medieval women actually lived, and it's the part of the story most thoroughly buried under the assumption that their names simply weren't in the records. Here's the assumption, and it's a comfortable one because it excuses us from looking. Medieval economic life was men's business. The merchants, the craftsmen, the guildsmen, the traders were all men, and women, if they worked at all, helped their husbands in a supporting, invisible, unrecorded way, leaving no trace in the documents because they held no independent economic standing worth recording. It's a tidy story, and it falls apart the moment you actually open the records, because the records, the tax rolls, the court cases, the guild lists, the apprenticeship contracts, the property deeds, the wills, are full of women. Women buying and selling, women owning shops, women taking apprentices, women suing and being sued over debts and contracts, women running businesses in their own names. They're there. They were always there. The trick was never that the records were silent. It's that we were told not to expect to find women in them, so for a long time nobody looked, and when historians finally did look, the medieval town turned out to be running substantially on female labour and female enterprise. Start with the legal instrument that made independent business possible for a married woman, because it's the key that unlocks the whole chapter, and we touched on it earlier, the femme sole. Under the English common law of coverture, a married woman, a femme covert, normally had her legal identity absorbed into her husband's. She couldn't independently own property, make contracts, or sue in her own name, because in law she and her husband were one person, and that person was legally him. That's the restriction everyone knows about. But medieval towns, which lived and breathed on trade, found coverture commercially inconvenient, and so many of them developed a workaround with real teeth. A married woman could trade as a femme sole, literally a woman alone, legally single for the purposes of business. A wife trading as a femme sole could run her own business separately from her husband, make her own contracts, incur her own debts, be sued for those debts in her own name, and keep her enterprise legally distinct from his. In effect, the town gave a married woman the legal personhood to be a businesswoman that the general common law denied her because the town needed her trade and her taxes. London had this custom. Other trading towns had versions of it. So the medieval townswoman was not, legally, doomed to invisibility. The law of the town carved out a space for her to stand on her own economic feet, and women stood on it. And they worked in an astonishing range of trades, which is the thing that surprises people who imagine women confined to a few feminine tasks. Yes, women dominated certain trades. We've already seen brewing, and textile work of many kinds was heavily female, and women were everywhere in the food trades, as bakers and hucksters and market sellers. But the records show women in a huge spread of occupations, as merchants and traders, as shopkeepers of every description, in the metal trades, in leatherwork, in the making and selling of goods across the whole urban economy. Widows especially often continued their late husband's businesses. A widow who inherited a workshop frequently kept it running, kept the apprentices, kept the customers, and ran the enterprise herself, sometimes for decades, sometimes with a skill that made the business flourish. Because a workshop was a going concern, and when the master died, the person who'd often been managing the books and the household and half the trade all along, his widow, was frequently the obvious and capable person to take it over. Widowhood, once again, that grim doorway, opened onto real economic power. Let me give you the single most vivid example, because it's a whole industry, run by women, hiding in plain sight in one of the great cities of medieval Europe, the silk women of London. Silk work, the making of fine silk thread, ribbons, laces, trimmings, and small silk goods, was, in medieval London, essentially a women's craft, practiced and controlled by women, and it was a real skilled trade with real economic weight, supplying a luxury market that wanted these expensive, fashionable goods. The silkwomen ran their own businesses. They took female apprentices, formerly on proper terms of years, training up the next generation of skilled workers exactly as any craft did. Girls apprenticed to a mistress to learn the silk trade over a period of years. They bought raw silk, often imported at considerable expense. They organised the labour, they produced the goods, and they sold them, and the whole operation was female from the mistress at the top to the apprentice at the bench. Here's a fully functioning skilled craft, generating real money in the luxury economy of London, staffed and owned and managed and passed down entirely by women, and it operated for generations. And these women knew their own worth as a trade, because when their industry was threatened, they organised and petitioned to protect it, collectively in writing to the highest authority in the land. The London silk women, over the 15th century, submitted petitions to Parliament and the Crown seeking protection for their craft against the competition of foreign imports that undercut them. And these petitions described the silk trade as a substantial industry employing large numbers of women, an important part of the city's economy worth defending. Read that as what it is, a body of tradeswomen, conscious of themselves as an economic interest group, lobbying the government to protect their livelihood, and doing it successfully enough to get protective measures passed. That is not economic invisibility. That is an organised female industry advocating for itself at the level of national policy and getting results. The silk women weren't a footnote, they were a lobby. Now the great catch, and I want to be honest about it because it's the crucial limitation, is the formal craft guild. The guilds were the powerful, prestigious institutions that regulated most skilled trades. They controlled who could practice a craft, set standards, managed apprenticeships, and conferred the status and the political voice that came with formal membership. And women's relationship to the guilds was genuinely restricted. Full independent guild membership, with its rights and its political standing, was in most trades and most places difficult or impossible for a woman to hold in her own right. The silk women, tellingly, never formed a fully chartered guild of the prestigious kind, despite running a whole industry, which historians read as exactly this ceiling in action. So the exclusion from the top tier of formal institutional power was real, and I don't want to paper over it. But, and this is the point that matters, exclusion from full guild membership did not mean exclusion from the work, or from owning a business, or from making money, or from taking apprentices, or from mattering economically. Women were deeply woven into guild-regulated crafts even where they couldn't hold full membership, as the wives and widows of masters who did much of the work, as workers, and often with real customary rights. A master's widow could frequently continue his craft and keep his workshop and his apprentices, exercising through her late husband's status the practical rights of a member, even if the formal membership itself was gendered male. So the picture is neither women were equal guild members, nor women were shut out of the crafts entirely. It's the more interesting reality of women doing the work and running the businesses in and around institutions that denied them the top formal rank, present and productive everywhere, formally enfranchised almost nowhere. Let's go across to the continent, to one of the great commercial cities of medieval Europe, to see how visible working women could be, because Cologne, the great German trading city on the Rhine, offers something almost unique. Trades in which women did have their own recognised organisations. In Cologne, certain crafts dominated by women. In silk and in the making of gold thread, the luxury textile trades again developed formal or semi-formal guild-like structures of their own, women's craft organisations that regulated those female-dominated trades. It was unusual, and historians debate exactly how far the parallel with men's guilds goes, but Cologne shows that where a trade was female enough and important enough, women's economic activity could crystallise into the kind of formal organisation we usually assume was closed to them. The exclusion, in other words, wasn't a law of nature. It was a set of customs that could bend when the economic reality pushed hard enough, and in a few places it bent all the way into recognised female guilds. And beneath the name trades and the famous silkwomen lay the vast, teeming, less documented world of ordinary working women that filled every medieval town, and this is where the sheer scale of it lives. Women worked as hucksters and petty retailers, buying goods and reselling them in small quantities in the market. The middlewomen of the everyday economy. They worked in the victualling trades, selling food and drink, running cookshops, hawking bread and fish and ale. They worked as spinners, the spinning of thread being so overwhelmingly female a task that, as we saw, it gave us the word spinster. They worked in domestic service in great numbers, young women earning wages and saving toward a dowry or an independent life. They worked as laundresses, as midwives, as nurses, as wet nurses, as keepers of lodging houses, and they appear constantly in the court records, not as victims and not as curiosities, but as ordinary economic actors, suing to recover debts owed to them, being sued for debts they owed, testifying in commercial disputes, defending their property, enforcing contracts. Every one of those court appearances is a woman, the legal system recognised as a person who could owe money, be owed money, and go to law about it, which is to say, an economic agent in her own right, generating exactly the documentary trace we were told didn't exist. There's a broader pattern historians have drawn out of all this, and it's worth stating because it explains both the visibility and its limits. Women's economic activity tended to be widest and most autonomous in the trades and places that were least prestigious, least profitable, and least formally organised, and it tended to narrow precisely where a trade became lucrative, high status, and tightly guild-controlled. It's the brewing story again, generalised. As long as work was humble, women did it freely and in huge numbers, and the moment work became prestigious and powerful, the formal structures closed around it and eased women toward the margins, which means the invisibility of medieval working women in the traditional story is partly an artefact of what got counted as important. The prestigious guild master with his charter and his political voice got remembered as the medieval economy, and the huckster, the spinster, the silkwoman, the widow running the shop, the femme soul trading in her own name, all got filed under not really economic history, even though together they were an enormous part of how the medieval town actually fed, clothed and supplied itself. So the correction here is maybe the most sweeping in this whole series, because it's not about a handful of exceptional queens or scholars. It's about the ordinary economic texture of medieval life. The medieval town was not a male economy with a few women helping at the edges. It was an economy in which women bought and sold and lent and borrowed and manufactured and retailed at every level, owned businesses, took apprentices, trained the next generation, organised to protect their trades, and turned up in the records in their thousands doing all of it. The law of the town invented the femme soul precisely because so many married women were trading independently that the legal fiction of coverture had to give way to commercial reality. The silk women of London ran a whole luxury industry and lobbied Parliament to defend it. The women of Cologne organised their trades, and the market squares of every town in Europe were full, every single day, of women making a living, visible to anyone who cared to count them, recorded in the documents for anyone who cared to read. They weren't missing from the records. They were in the records the whole time, waiting for someone to stop assuming they wouldn't be. And when historians finally read the tax rolls and the court books and the apprenticeship contracts looking for women instead of past them, the women were right there on the page, signing, selling, suing, and running the shop. Chapter 10, and our last. Let's close this whole thing where the medieval world was least prepared to find a woman at all, in armour, on the battlefield, at the head of an army, with the fighters and the rebels, and the ones who simply picked up a sword and forced the chroniclers, appalled and fascinated, to write them down. Because if there's one arena the Middle Ages theoretically reserved for men, absolutely and without exception, it was war. War was the defining function of the aristocracy, the whole justification for the knightly class, the thing a nobleman was born and trained and armed to do. And women, in the official picture, had no place in it. They were what men fought to protect, the prize and the reason, never the participant. So when a woman did take up arms, did lead troops, did command a siege, did put on armour and ride to war, she broke the deepest rule of the entire system, and the chroniclers who recorded it didn't know whether to condemn her or marvel at her, and often did both in the same breath. And there were more of them than the official picture allows, scattered across the whole medieval millennium, and they were real, and some of them were very, very good at it. Let's begin far back, in early 10th century England, with a woman who wasn't a rebel or an exception forced to fight, but a full, planning, strategic war leader, Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians. She was a daughter of Alfred the Great, the King of Wessex who fought the Vikings to a standstill, and she was married to the ruler of Mercia, the neighbouring English kingdom, at a time when much of England lay under Viking control, in the region called the Danelaw. When her husband fell ill and then died, Ethelfled did not retreat into widowhood. She took up the rule of Mercia herself, and she ruled it, and more than that, she made war. Ethelfled was a central figure in the English reconquest of the Danelaw, working in concert with her brother Edward, the King of Wessex, in a coordinated campaign to push back Viking power, and her role was not symbolic. She built fortresses, a network of fortified burhs, planting strongholds to hold and consolidate territory, the same strategy her father Alfred had used, executed by his daughter across Mercia. She led armies. She campaigned against the Vikings and the Welsh. She captured strongholds. She took the key stronghold of Derby. She secured Leicester, and by the end of her life even the Viking-held city of York was reportedly prepared to submit to her. She was, in plain terms, one of the most effective military and political leaders in England in her generation. And she happened to be a woman, and the chroniclers of the age recorded her campaigns as the serious military history they were. She died in 918 at the height of her power, and she'd spent her last years directing the reconquest of England from the north. A war leader in full, remembered by the title her own people gave her, the Lady of the Mercians. Now let's meet my favourite figure in this entire chapter, because her story is pure vengeance and she is magnificently terrifying. Jeanne de Clisson, the woman they called the Lioness of Brittany. In the 14th century, during the Tangled Wars in Brittany that were part of the larger Hundred Years' War, Jeanne de Clisson was a Breton noblewoman whose husband, Olivier de Clisson, was accused of treason by the French crown and executed, beheaded, and his head by some accounts displayed as a warning. And Jeanne's response to the killing of her husband was not grief that stayed indoors, it was war. She sold off her remaining lands and possessions to raise money, she assembled a force, and, this is the part that turns her from a grieving widow into a legend, she took to the sea. She acquired ships, had them painted black with red sails so they'd be recognised and feared, and she became a privateer, a pirate, hunting French vessels in the English Channel for years, in what everyone understood was a personal war of vengeance against the French king who had killed her husband. The Lioness of Brittany, raiding French shipping from her black-sailed fleet, was said to be merciless to French crews. She waged this private naval war for years, allied in effect with the English side, and she survived it, and she died not on a scaffold or in a battle, but old, years later, having outlived her revenge. A medieval widow who answered her husband's execution by becoming a pirate queen and terrorising the king's shipping for the better part of a decade. The chroniclers could hardly not write her down, and neither can we. Let's set beside her a woman who fought not for vengeance but simply, ferociously, in the thick of a battle because that was where the moment put her. Sichelgaita, the Lombard princess who rode to war with her Norman husband in the 11th century. Sichelgaita was married to Robert Guiscard, the formidable Norman adventurer who carved out a domain in southern Italy, and she was no passive consort. She accompanied him on his campaigns in armour, and she fought. Our most vivid source is the Byzantine princess and historian Anna Komnene, herself a remarkable learned woman, who wrote about Sichelgaita with a kind of astonished respect, describing her as a formidable figure on the battlefield. There's a famous moment Anna records. At a critical point in a battle, when part of Robert Guiscard's army broke and began to flee in panic, it was Sichelgaita, armoured, mounted, who rallied them, charging after the fleeing men, reportedly roaring at them to turn back and fight like men, driving her own routing soldiers back into the line. Picture that. The battle turning, the men running, and the person who stops the rout and saves the day is the commander's wife in full armour, bellowing them back into the fight. She was, by the accounts, genuinely fearsome in war, and one of the sharpest women writers of the medieval world thought her worth describing at length as a warrior. She was a woman who went to war and was good at it, and the record says so plainly. And there were more, threaded all through the period, because once you start looking, the battlefield is less exclusively male than the theory insists. We've already met, in earlier chapters, the noble women who defended castles under siege, Nicola de la Haye holding Lincoln in her 60s, the ladies who commanded fortresses while their lords were away, and castle defence was a genuine form of medieval warfare, a woman directing the men on the walls, managing the provisions, holding a fortified position against an army, and doing it successfully. There were women who led the defence of towns. There were noble women who, when their family's cause demanded it and no man was available, took command of the family's military affairs. The point is not that every medieval woman fought, of course not, any more than every medieval man did, but that the absolute wall the theory imagined, the total exclusion of women from war, was in practice repeatedly breached, by widows and wives and daughters and rulers who took up the sword or the command when circumstance and capability came together, and who were recorded doing it because they were impossible to ignore. And of course, there is one figure this chapter has been walking toward the whole time, the one everyone knows, and she deserves her place not as a mystical exception, but as the culmination of everything we've traced. Joan of Arc. Because Joan is the medieval warrior woman raised to the highest possible power and set at the very centre of history, and her story compresses this whole series into a single burning life. She was, and this is the part worth sitting with, nobody, a peasant girl from the village of Domremy in eastern France, illiterate, of no rank, no wealth, no military training, no claim to anything, born into the very bottom of a society obsessed with birth, and in the midst of the 100 Years' War, with France losing, with the English and their Burgundian allies holding much of the country, and the French heir uncrowned, and his cause near collapse, this teenage peasant girl presented herself and said that God had sent her to save France and see the heir-crowned king. Everything about that should have ended in her being turned away at the first door. Instead, and the sequence of events is so unlikely that it's part of why people reach for the miraculous. She got her hearing, she got to the heir Charles, she was examined and questioned and somehow believed, or believed enough to be tried, and she was given armour and a place with the army sent to relieve the besieged city of Orléans. And then she delivered. That's the thing that stops the story from being merely strange, and makes it world-changing. It worked. Joan, at Orléans in 1429, was at the heart of the effort that broke the English siege and relieved the city, a stunning reversal that transformed the war's momentum and around which the demoralised French rallied. She was present, armoured, carrying her banner in the fighting. She was wounded and returned to the field, and after Orléans she pressed on, urging the campaign forward through further victories, driving toward the goal she'd named from the start, and she achieved it. She saw Charles brought to Reims, the traditional coronation city, and crowned King Charles VII, with Joan herself present at the coronation, the peasant girl standing in the cathedral beside the king she'd said God sent her to make. A teenage girl of no birth had, in the space of months, altered the course of the greatest war of the age and put a king on his throne. Christine de Pizan, as we saw, was still alive to write her poem of exultation, seeing in Joan the living proof of everything she'd argued. And then it went the way these stories so often go when the men who'd used the woman found her inconvenient. Joan was eventually captured, taken by the Burgundians and sold to the English, who wanted her destroyed not merely as an enemy but as a symbol, because a peasant girl who beat them in the name of God was intolerable to everything they needed to be true, and so they tried her, in a church court, on charges of heresy, and much was made, tellingly, of the fact that she wore men's clothing and men's armour, that she had crossed exactly the line this chapter is about, a woman who took the dress and the role and the weapons of a man. The trial was a rigged, hostile proceeding designed to reach the verdict its organisers needed, and it reached it. Joan was condemned, and, in 1431, burned at the stake at Rouen, still a teenager, perhaps 19. The girl who'd crowned a king was executed as a heretic by the enemy she'd beaten, abandoned by the king she'd made, who lifted no serious hand to save her. But the story doesn't end at the stake, and this is the part that matters for how we close, because the verdict didn't hold. Years later, after the war had turned decisively France's way, after the king Joan had crowned had secured his kingdom, her case was reopened, retried, and the original condemnation was examined and overturned, declared unjust, Joan formally vindicated. And the vindication kept growing across the centuries until it reached its fullest possible form. The girl, burned as a heretic was, in the 20th century canonised, made St. Joan of Arc, one of the patron saints of France, the peasant girl who saved a kingdom enrolled among the holy. The judgment of the men who burned her was not the final judgment. History reversed their verdict as thoroughly as a verdict can be reversed, and the name they tried to destroy became one of the most luminous in the whole story of France. And that reversal is exactly the note I want to end this series on, because it's the pattern underneath every chapter we've spent these nights on. Over and over we've watched the same shape. A woman does something the official story says women don't do. Runs the estate, writes the medicine, brews the beer, argues the philosophy, rules the kingdom, owns the shop, leads the army. And does it well. Does it in the full light of the record. And then the culture, afterward, works to explain her away, to doubt her, to soften her, to file her under exception or legend or scandal, to write her out of the version that gets handed down. Trotter doubted out of existence because her medicine was too good. The Brewsters costumed into witches once their trade turned profitable. Heloise remembered as a lover instead of a philosopher, Hildegard as a mystic instead of a reformer. The queens praised for ruling like men because the language had no other way to admit a woman had ruled at all. The working women assumed absent from records they filled. And Joan burned by the enemy she'd beaten, then slowly, over 500 years, restored. So the real answer to the question this whole series is named for, why you couldn't handle medieval women, isn't that they were secret superheroes or that the Middle Ages were some hidden paradise of equality. They weren't, and it wasn't. The walls were real. The law was often against these women, and most of them fought uphill their whole lives. The answer is that the medieval world was already, constantly, quietly running on the competence of women who were told they had none. And that the version we inherited, the tapestry and tower version, the women weren't their version, is itself a kind of medieval fiction, drafted by the people who held the pens, and believed by us because no one told us to check. The women were always there, in the account rolls and the court books and the chronicles and the coinage and the manuscripts and the trial records. They ran the manor and wrote the medicine, and brewed the ale and argued the theology, and crowned the kings and owned the shops and led the armies. You couldn't handle them because you were never told the truth about them. And the truth, once you go looking, is right there on the page, in their own names, waiting. And that's where I'll leave you tonight, and where I'll leave this whole series. Thank you for spending these long, quiet nights here with me, drifting off to the true stories of women who are far more than the history books let them be. If these have kept you company in the dark and eased you towards sleep, that's the only thing I ever hoped they'd do. Rest well. The fire's burning low, the manuscripts are back on their shelves, and all those remarkable women are exactly where they always were. In the record, real, and finally getting read. Good night.